Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Umbris Fear Manifest, a blue-black exile mill and clone and blink deck. It is very, very cool, and it is one of our donation decks that comes from Royal Beast, who says, "Hi Cursed, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this deck and what could be improved. The goal is to win through exile/mill. I plan to copy, clone, blink Umbris as often as possible to trigger its ability multiple times and have a creature to play defensively. Some cards replace/add mill with the combat damage." Absolutely. You know, when I saw this deck sent to me and I took a look at Umbris and I was thinking to myself, oh, I hope this is blink and clone. I hope this is blink and clone. So I'm really, really excited that it is. It's such a fun, I love that archetype of blinking and cloning. But the question is going to be, is that good with Umbris? And I'm going to say mostly. I really like what this deck is doing, but I will have some opinions on how fun of an idea it is, but what the ceiling of its power also is. But that's a lot for us to cover, so let's start with the commander. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Umbris Fear Manifest and why are they our blue-black commander? Well, Umbris is a 5-mana nightmare horror. Starts off being a 1/1 but rarely actually is. Umbris gets +1/+1 for each card your opponents own in exile. But we're here for that second ability. Whenever Umbris or another nightmare or horror enters the battlefield under your control, target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a land card. This means in order to mill your opponents out, instead of needing 100 triggers, you only generally need 33 to 35, because that's probably the amount of lands left in their deck after we count their opening hand, anything they pull out of their deck, and naturally playing lands. I will note that 33 to 35 triggers is not that much better than 100 in a game of Magic, but I will also note, and why I was so happy to see this, is there's an inherent synergy with cloning Umbris. See, Umbris triggers on ETB and when someone else, when another nightmare ETBs as well. So when you play an Umbris or blink an Umbris, you get 1 trigger, but when you clone an Umbris, you get 2. The original seeing the clone come in and the clone coming in itself. And then, of course, if you get a third clone, now you're getting 3 triggers? Yeah, 3 triggers. Yeah, you get an additional trigger per Umbris. Pretty simple. And then even better, of course, as you play other horrors and nightmares. This is particularly strong and can mill out your opponents very, very quickly. But, and looking at the deck, what was my point in saying about a ceiling on something like this? Now, I really like this deck and I really like where it's going. But one of the things that makes it a little tricky is that Umbris, as a core component of a combo deck, is 5 mana. I think recently I was just talking about the wieldiness of commanders that are, 6, 7 mana, and that you can use them sometimes as, get out of jail free cards where your deck has been struggling. You slam Atraxa, the 7-mana Atraxa can be a card that refills your hand, or Kozilek, the original Kozilek, or the second one, you draw a bunch of cards. Umbris is under that, being 5 mana, but is not a catch-up mechanic. Umbris is the main thing you want to do. And so when our main way of interacting with the game is our commander at 5 mana, and the main way we interact with our commander is having cards that are generally 4 to 5 mana themselves, it is quite a high ceiling of mana. This can be a little clunky when you are trying to fit the deck in certain power levels, because in a deck like this, like the one we're looking at right now, we've got cards like Mana Vault in order to power out our commander as fast as possible. But if we were going to go into a lower power level, like a real low power level, we'd be fine there too, because usually low power levels, nothing is really happening, and therefore you can get away with playing Umbris, waiting a turn cycle, and then throwing a clone onto them. But it's that middle power level that's a little tricky, right? Where your opponents are playing very strong spells, but not quite to the level of Mana Vault, or they don't have tutors. And this deck, I think, would have a hard time beating decks that just aim to go fast, or aim to just bash face. And so there's a bit of tension there. Now, this isn't the worst tension. This is something we can very much so work around, but I think it is worth noting. Before we go over individual cards, as always, it's good to look at our land count and our mana curve. Looking at our land count, we've got 36 lands, which I think is pretty good. We have quite a few mana rocks, so we're definitely higher than the normal amount, which makes sense with a 5 mana commander. And then we look at our curve, and our curve's really nice. At 9 mana, we have Rite of Replication that is kicked, and at 7 mana, we have Toxrill. Otherwise, we're hanging around 5 mana as our highest one of which is our commander, and the other few being particularly strong. I'm gonna get back to that. But otherwise, when it comes to the curve, I'm pretty happy with it. Looking at the deck itself and looking at the card quality, we have a bit of discrepancy, but this is normal. The first discrepancy is normal, where we have, really, really strong cards, such as where's our Mana Drain is here. We have Mana Vault, we got Mystic Remora, Black Market Connections, Rhystic Study. Cards I believe to be very, very strong. Slip Out the Back, Essence Flux are really, really strong cards, Chain of Vapors. But at the same time, we're playing cards like Blur, Displace, Ghostly Figure, 3 Steps Ahead, which I'm not going to say are bad cards and Blink strategies, they're pretty strong. It's more to do with the fact that we are using this, we're using these 2 piles together. And I think this just goes back to the same idea that this deck's power level is kind of in flux, and I think that's a normal side effect of a deck like this. I sometimes, when I look over people's decks, I'm trying to not shortcut, but like find what the problems are really quickly, and this kind of thing is very, very visible in decks that are trying to figure out their power level. Now, that's the first discrepancy. The second discrepancy, and I think the one I'm going to be more picky at, is the discrepancy between cards that are what I'm going to call strategy adjacent. Now, generally when we build decks that are very dependent on our commanders, such as Umbris here, we try to include cards that either substitute for or in a very similar vein provide an alternative to our commander. And we can, for example, the most identifiable one in this deck is Consuming Aberration. Consuming Aberration is what I would call strategy adjacent, and therein is a bit of the problem. Both Umbris and Consuming Aberration are incredibly similar cards, but they're so similar, except for the ways that they're not, that it's actually kind of a problem. See, both Umbris and Consuming Aberration mill out our opponent's decks a land at a time. Well, the cards before the land and the land, but still, one land at a time. Consuming Aberration and Umbris both grow based on the number of cards that they themselves are milling. However, they grow on different axes. One cares about cards in the graveyard, one cares about cards in exile. Now, this doesn't seem as bad as one might think it would be, but the problem is that in order to make the Consuming Aberration be more worthwhile for our commander Umbris, we have included cards such as Leyline of the Void, Dothy Voidwalker, we have Stoneguide Lantern, to kind of bridge that gap, turning the cards into the graveyard into cards in exile. But what that inadvertently does is turns Leyline of the Void out, and then you try to cast Consuming Aberration, and it just dies every single time, right? Because there will never be cards in your graveyard, in your opponent's graveyard, which is what you want. And so we have a 5 mana card that sometimes does nothing. Very much so sticks out to me. And there's a few others that we'll get around to that do very similar things. Toxrill the Corrosive also feels particularly weird here. In a deck that already wants to hit very high mana to cast multiple spells to immediately do something, Toxrill is both slow, as it depends on you getting to your end step with this still alive, and a lot of mana. I do get that it is a horror, which does technically work with our commander, but this isn't the kind of card you cast when your commander's out. Like, you have to have nothing else, because if your commander's out, you want to cast, something that triggers a lot of different horrors coming into play, or clones, or blinks, or anything like that. and Toxrill is not that. In fact, Toxrill also does not work particularly well with the blinking. Toxrill does work really well with the cloning, with the blinking and the cloning, and Toxrill, though, when the blinking does not help except for protecting your creatures from Toxrill, which Toxrill doesn't affect your creatures. So this is a card that just kind of sticks out to me as being like here to be the top end. A card that really reminds me of the equivalent of Elesh Norn, but in blue-black. And I think we have better options for Elesh Norn in blue-black, from, you know, just Shieldred to other big mana cards, or even other blink cards, such as, I didn't put this in my additions, but there's that 7 mana card that when it enters the battlefield, you take control of a creature. And then it says something, if you control three or more permanents you don't own, you draw like 3 cards every turn. That's not as important as the fact that you could blink that creature and start stealing a bunch of stuff. So with that in mind, I think Toxrill also stands out as a card I don't particularly like. Looking at a few others here and there, once again, this kind of adjacent nature of it is something I do note. The Celephid Face Taker is also very, very notable as being not what you want, because first of all, you can't have this become a copy of legendaries, because without having things like Mirror Box out, you don't actually, they're just going to destroy each other with the legend rule, or destroy themselves with the legend rule. But even worse, this doesn't have an ETB, so you don't even get the trigger. You just basically lose the Celephid for no reason. And then even worse is that we are trading our immense creature. Oh no, you know what? It does grow, I will say. I misunderstood what this part did. So it would be a very big version of our commander that's technically unblockable, but I think we're already finding better ways to get around that, such as using Rite of Consumption, Essence Harvest, notably Altar of Dementia. These are better ways to take advantage of the heightened power and toughness our commander has than by playing a clunky 3-mana creature that destroys our commander, unless we have very specific things. I think we can do a little better in that regard, so it stands out as not being great. Likewise, Wharf Infiltrator is a card I've always liked. It's in my cube. It's a great card, but it's not what we want here. We neither have the spare mana to trigger that, to pay for that ability, nor do we discard creature cards like willingly and often to trigger it in the first place. Like, basically, this is this card does work completely by itself. Like, you attack with it, you loot, and then you pay 2, and then you get a Eldrazi Horror, which I do get, that's why it's here. But that's just really clunky. Like, there's a lot of turns that I don't think I think you just don't have the mana to use this. So we're just kind of spending this out to loot and nothing else. And I think we can do a lot better. We could just play like other looting effects, especially the creatures who tap to loot. Therein we have more control over it, and we don't have to get damage in. And Skulk is not the same as unblockable, so things to consider. Another one that kind of catches my eye is the Raise the Palisade. I think it's Palisade. You'll have to tell me if I'm incorrect in saying that. Choose a creature type, return all creatures that aren't of the chosen type to their owner's hand. As much as I do see why it's here to be kind of like, let's bounce everything but Umbris and our copies, let's attack all our opponents and get that done, I'm going to show you already are playing a better version of this, and that's Toxic Deluge. Toxic Deluge does the same thing, but much, much better. 5 mana is just a lot for this effect. I would say having a 1 mana make target creature unblockable spell, or having a, I believe black has for 2 mana, give all your creatures menace, or give all your creatures fear. Things like that that aren't the same as unblockable, but are pretty close, might just be more worthwhile. Don't get me wrong, I do understand that in a pinch, this will still work as a evacuate, but sorcery speed for these kind of abilities is just really not ideal. There's a reason that we really like Cyclonic Rift over, well, evacuate, right? with looking to our artifacts, there's also a few here that I just don't particularly like. Soul Guide Lantern and Stone of Erech are both just okay. Like, I'm gonna lump Leyline of the Void in here. Like Dauthi Voidwalker is a fantastic card. I'm not gonna complain of Dauthi Voidwalker. But these other few, I think, are just a little clunky. I get what you're going for here, that there are cards that allow you to make up for incidental mill or cards going to the graveyard naturally just to power your commander. And I think you can just do better. And I don't mean that in you can do better in this type of card, quality of this type of card, like Dauthi Voidwalker. I mean literally, I don't think you should be playing these kind of cards. I think Dauthi Voidwalker gets the pass because of how insanely powerful it is. And then like, there's like Author of Shadows, which would be the only other one I'd be willing to take because it's a blink synergy. It ETBs, exiles all opponents' graveyards, and then you get one of those cards that you can cast at any time for the rest of the game. Like, that's the only way I'd be willing to do it, and I'm not suggesting that because it's just yet another 5-mana card into this deck. I think these just should be removed and just like replaced with card draw or more utility creatures, but I'll get to that myself. I just feel like they're clunky, and I get why they're here, but I think you're looking too deep at synergy when you should be looking at utility of these cards. Likewise, something like Mind Stone, I think, is just okay. It's probably the weakest mana rock in your deck. Mind Crank as well feels just okay. If you're hitting your opponent for meaningful mill, like through damage, I think you're usually killing them. Like, I know this is really good incidentally of milling your opponents through when they hit each other, and I know you could be like, oh, I swing with my commander's like 50 plus, and all of a sudden, bam, they're gonna mill 50 cards. Obviously, the joke is that they're gonna lose to commander damage before they mill 50 cards, but it is something to consider. I've played a few games recently where Mind Crank just happened to be on my opponent's side, and that me and my other two opponents were just being like incidentally milled by attacking each other by like just regular damage or like red burn that just happened to be thrown around. And I'm gonna say, honestly, I was never impressed by it. It was never something that made me think about it or like care about it. Now they weren't backed up by like full mill decks, and several times I felt like there were cards going to my graveyard that I would prefer to be in my graveyard. So your mileage will vary, but once again, it feels like this is a whole card meant to be clunky with our commander, even though it's meant, or it's meant to be not clunky with our commander. It's meant to be good with our commander, but it just comes across as clunky. Whereas something like Mind Skinner, I have a lot more patience for because it's on theme as a nightmare. It triples the kind of damage that certain creatures are going to do. And you know what? It's a 10-1 that'll do reasonable mill. It's fine. I don't think it's the best. There's going to be situations where Umbris is lethal and you're going to wish that your Mind Skinner wasn't on the battlefield. But what can you do? You can only work with what you got. Realm Breaker, the Invasion Tree. This is another one that I'm having a really, really hard time with because once again, this is target opponent mills, land card from graveyard. It's the same situation where this is adjacent to our commander's plan. It doesn't work with our commander's plan because our commander exiles, and so instead we've got this kind of clunky idea of having cards that just kind of work with the idea, but not really. In fact, I don't know how often you're actually going to use this ability when you could once again be using it to play some of your really, really strong cards, and I think therein is the problem. Otherwise, I do generally like this deck. I think the strong parts are very, very strong. And though I said something about power level and figuring it out, I think I'm pretty happy with the power level just staying around where it is. Honestly, if you took out the mana vault and maybe the mana drain, depending on your group, I think this is kind of fine in power level as it is when we turn the rest of the cards that I've suggested to cut into just value cards or cards that give you alternatives to your commander without them being adjacent. Last thing I'll say before we go into that, Kindred Discovery is a great pick for this deck, and I really do like it. And I do love Uchulon. you might have heard me talking about adjacent cards and been like, well, Cursed, what about a Chulon? A Chulon triggers off of exiling creatures from your opponent's graveyards, which is something you can't do if all of your mill is exiling. So why don't you dislike a Chulon? And I have a secret. It's because I love a Chulon. A Chulon is so funny. It is hilarious as a card. It makes me so happy to see it. It is not a good card. I say that as someone who loves this card. It really isn't. But I love seeing it get played. And if it doesn't see play in the deck like this, where is it going to see play? Notably, going back to the rhetorical question I was asking about why keep a Chulon if there won't be cards in graveyards, once again, I'll point to the fact that if we take out the Leyline of the Void, if we take out the Stone of Eric, if we or Erich, once again, not sure, Soul Guide Lantern, those cards, then the Chulon will at least get some creatures here and there off of combat damage and things like that. I don't know. It's not great, but also I still love it. Chulon is fantastic. It is a crab ooze horror. What's not to like? All right, let's look at some additions. Okay, this is not a joke, even though it feels a little bit. Nazgul is something I wanted to talk about, but I want to keep it short. I don't want to make every blue-black deck with a heavy blink and clone theme be a Nazgul deck, but I think it's something that's worth considering. A lot of my other additions are going to be cards that are blinkable or otherwise good targets for the deck to kind of function with should your commander plan not be working. And if you want to say, well, Cursed, I don't want to deal with any of those. I want one straightforward plan as our backup that works really well here. The Nazgul are it, right? You get to have up to 9 copies and you don't actually need to run all 9. Though I believe it's blasphemy not to. It is the kind of thing I would do to run less than 9 Nazgul. But it is something you get to do playing multiple of a card, and it is a really good backup plan, especially should your commander be inaccessible to you, especially if there's a lot of creature hate. Nazgul are here to be a really nice backup plan to, you know, go through growing each after another, each of them growing further and further the more creatures you have, much like how, the more creatures, the more ring wraiths that you have, much like how our commander works with cloning. I've made a few videos now, I think at least a handful, on decks that were sent to me as Nazgul decks, and if you're interested, or if you're, you know, watching this video and you think, hey, that's pretty cool, go watch those. It'll give you a really good idea. They're really strong, but they're not necessarily my suggestion. I just noticed this. I thought it'd be amiss to not point it out, so here it is. All right, let's go into real additions. Hello the Host is very notable to me because it is, I think, one of the much better clone effects that you can have access to, while being like still a lot of mana, but really interesting in a number of ways in your deck. Because one, obviously this is a cloning effect that triggers every turn on your combat, but it also notably doesn't care if the creature's legendary. It's not a legendary token. But 2, it's also something you can preemptively put out. We have a few of those, but we don't have a ton of them. There's like a teleportation one in white. It's like the same text as Thassa, where like end step you blink something. There's also things like the Soul Guide. No, that's a different one. There's the 3-mana white-blue creature that blinks at end step 2. Like, we just don't have access to any of those because we're in black and not white. So Helm of the Host is notable as being one of those options where we can play this early and it just stays on the battlefield until we need it. And we can just equip it to one of our other creatures, our other blink creatures, and just get a little advantage here and there while we play our turn around to get to the position where we can pull out our commander and start winning. So for a lot of reasons, I really like this. Obviously, with all the mana ramp that we have, this being 4 colorless and 5 colorless is just nice and easier to play with, especially with cards like the Grim Monolith. But it is a big, clunky card at times, and I did want to acknowledge that. The ceiling's very high, but the floor is pretty low. All right, let's talk about blink targets. The first one I wanted to talk about was Boggart Trawler. So first I wanted to take a moment to talk about MDFCs in this deck. The main point here is that this deck can probably play at least 2 to 3 MDFCs, which are, for those who don't know, cards that are lands on the back and I guess spells on the front. Now, there was a bunch of them released in Modern Horizons 3, and I think it's pretty arguable that the blue-black ones are the best. In Commander for sure, but especially in like constructed formats, the blue ones are very, very good. And Boggart Trawler is both very, very good as a blink target because it has a very relevant exile target player's graveyard effect, while also, you know, just being a land on the other side, which is particularly good. So I think this one's pretty free to play. I would also play the blue spell card. I can never remember what it's called. It's like into something, but it is. It bounces a creature or spell back to your. Maybe it's even a non-land permanent, but it bounces a card back to your opponent's hand, or if it's a spell on the stack, it also bounces it back, which is really, really powerful and allows you to do really, really fun things while still being a land and counting towards your land count, which is nice once again with this deck with a really high. Like you want to hit a high mana value because you want to be able to cast your commander and immediately clone it, preferably. So this is a very easy hit in my mind. After that, another one that I do particularly like is Aether Channeler. This is just has a lot of utility to it because the floor is that you draw a card on ETB and you draw a card on Blink or Clone technically. And I do like that. I think the return another non-land permanent to its owner's hand is very, very close because it can be very good against certain opponents when they're trying to do things. And of course with Blink and getting to instant speed, you can also do this as a very good trick to negate equipment, to negate auras, anything like that that's going to attach, to blink a creature out of combat, all of that. It's very, very good. I will say, most likely, oftentimes, if you get this down and on turn 4 you get Thassa, you're basically going to be getting an extra card every turn cycle with the threat of bouncing your opponent's cards, and I think that's a good deal. I will note, this does make birds. I don't know when you're going to make birds. This is not really the deck that wants to make 1/1 birds, but it's worth noting that it does make birds. After that, we've got Ruthless Technomancer, and this is the one I was thinking the most. I kind of like organized it by CMC, but this was the first one on my list, and probably the one I think you would benefit the most from. Ruthless Technomancer is notable because it works both very much so with Blink and is a very good ramp card for a deck like this. On ETB, you sacrifice another creature, and then you create treasure tokens equal to that creature's power. Then it has a reanimation ability where you sacrifice X artifacts to get a creature with power X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. X can't be 0. So, the way this works in your deck, besides like general ideas of sacrificing creatures and blinking this for more sacrifices, is that you play this with your commander out. When your commander is out, all of a sudden you're going to probably gain 30 plus treasures by sacrificing your commander. Then you let the commander go to the graveyard as opposed to on the battlefield, because in the graveyard your commander is a 1/1. Its ability only works when it is on the battlefield. For those who don't know, the only exception to that is cards that have star. When they have the stars, that means that you need to count them as whatever the cards are. Like Tarmogoyf is a classic of that, and it will always be whatever power the stars do. But this is not what this card is. It is 1/1. So it will cost 3 mana and 1 artifact. Sacrifice all of them, and because 2 and a black comes from treasures, then you sacrifice another treasure, and then you get your commander back into play. You get another trigger, and it's just as big as you had before. Obviously, if you like incorporate this with a blink ability that is an activated ability. Sorry, I'm starting to grasp the combo here, and the more I think of it, the better it gets. Play this card. So if you have an activated ability that blinks, you could then spend some of that mana. Yeah, this is just like our Darkside Extortionist, who's banned out of the format. I believe there's a lot of combos using Darkside to blink them infinitely to create infinite treasures. This is pretty close with a few more hoops. This is not even including the fact that a lot of clone creatures are 0/0s, and therefore with Ruthless Technomancer, let's say you have It's the one that looks like Jace, I'll have to remember. Spark Double. You have Spark Double on the battlefield so it's a 0/0, but on the battlefield, it is a copy of your commander. You then play Ruthless Technomancer. Ruthless Technomancer comes onto the battlefield, you sacrifice the Spark Double, and you make 30-something treasures. Spark Double is now in your graveyard. With it in your graveyard, you can pay 2 and a black from those treasures. You don't have to sacrifice any additional artifacts because his power is... Oh, X can't be 0. Sorry. This is still good, but I stopped reading. I was like, X can be 0. This is going to be good. Okay, so you still have to sacrifice one artifact, but I think that's still fine. You get the clone back into play. You get you can clone anything at that point. You can clone your commander again for another trigger, or you can clone the Ruthless Technomancer to get another trigger and sacrifice another card in case you needed more treasure. Regardless, all of this to say, basically, the Ruthless Technomancer is really, really good in this deck, which immediately makes me think of its cousin, which is the black creature, something of Bolas. So it would be Disciple of Bolas, which does a very, very similar thing. Of course, Disciple of Bolas then threatens to kill you if you hit your commander when it's like a 70 or 80 power creature. But yeah, I'm going to suggest both of these cards, both of them in your blink strategy, and both of them caring very much so of the immense power of your commander. These two, they're our friends, and it did make me think of one more card. That'll be our last card, the one I thought of. But moving forward, another very good blink target, I don't think this is a surprise, is Grey Merchant of Asphodel. This is just a good card with blink and clone strategies, as every blink gets another trigger, which gains you by itself 6 life every time you blink this creature, not including any other creature you have on the battlefield. But of course, every clone gets better and better. So if you have only this card out and you clone it, you then steal 4 life from each opponent, giving you a total of 12 life. And then with 2, that's 6 from each, 18. So I think you get 6 more every time you clone a Grey Merchant. That's a pretty good deal, especially when you're in a position when you're on the backswing or you're bleeding and you need to gain life. I am a big fan of having at least like one pretty good life gain engine in black decks that tend to want to use cards like Black Market Connections or Necropotence and things like that. So Grey Merchant is very, very strong here. And honestly, I think it does something better than the Consuming Aberration, because this threatens your opponents on a different axis, where repeated Grey Merchants will put you at a really high life total, but also threaten to burn them out, which can change the way your attacks work and change the way your opponents attack each other, which I tend to think is much more valuable than simply, having another mill engine in your mill deck. Another one, just because I've been suggesting this a lot and I still think it's worth suggesting, is Overlord of the Balesmirk. I guess there's no S in that. Overlord of the Balemirk. This is just a pretty good self-mill card that gets very strong when you can blink it. Note that until the impending goes off, you cannot blink it as a creature because it is only an enchantment, but if you have cards that allow you to blink enchantments, for example, you're going to be particularly happy. I think if you cast this on turn 2 and just let this hang around until I guess it would be turn 6, end of turn 6, where it is a creature, and then start blinking it from there, you'd be happy with it anyways. But it is $10. It is a card that is not cheap for an ability that I don't know if 100% it is the best, but I would be amiss to not mention it. All right, coming to the last few cards. The first 2 are just cards that I think are worth running. Dismember is a card I've mentioned before that if you are in black, this is your 1 mana removal that I think is absolutely worth running. This can also stand in for playing like Fatal Push and things like that. It never hurts to have a little more removal. I would say at the moment the deck is a little low. After that, Dark Ritual also sticks out at me as a card that like really will make a big difference of powering out certain cards early and powering out certain like artifacts, or even your commander out early. It's not going to be super, super consistent. It is it is fast mana, but like not in the same way as the artifacts that stick around. This is just a 1-turn fast mana engine. I generally like it. I like it more when we played cards, a lot of like 3 mana black cards, which this deck is much more blue than it's black. But once again, for our commander and a few other options, I think it's particularly good and worth considering. But this is the card I was really thinking of, Heartless Summoning. Now, let's start with the downside. It gives your creatures -1/-1, which does technically mean that you need to put at least one card in exile for each of your opponents, otherwise your commander is dead on arrival. You'll still get the trigger, so the next time you cast your commander, it'll be fine, but you've basically used the 2 less to cast, and then it died, so it has command tax, so you're right back where you started of just the next time to cast it, it's just full price. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. I think there's a world where you play Heartless Summoning turn 2, turn 3, you cast your commander, let it die, and immediately mill your opponents. And then once you have 5 mana, you cast your commander, and it's already coming out with a lot of power and toughness. I think that's pretty cool, but not necessarily what you want to do. Not including things you could do by letting it die and reanimating it, using feigned death effects and things like that. But the real reason I wanted to bring up Heartless Summoning is that I really do believe that 2 less to cast clause right here is very important in this deck. You have so many cards that are 4 mana and up. You have so many cards that are creatures that benefit very much so by that 2 less. The clones are almost universally 3 colorless and a blue, and sometimes they're 2 colorless and 2 blue. And in both cases, you'll get the full reduction in mana cost here, which is very good. This, as mentioned before, this reduces your commander from having the first basically it's as if you subtract commander tax for that first cast, which is really nice. And after that, it's 1 less command. I guess it's just statically 1 less commander tax every time. And that's really, really good. There's also another card that puts your commander into your hand. And I'm trying to remember what that was. It's worth considering. Yes, it's the Netherborn Altar. It's worth considering. It is a life cost as opposed to a mana cost. But once again, playing a deck that is so dependent on casting your commander with a vulnerable commander, I think it's going to be worthwhile to think of cards like this. Or on the other side, you could just play more reanimation effects and allow your commander to go into the graveyard. But that's not the same thing, right? Because when you put them in the graveyard, you tend to commit to that. Whereas Netherborn Altar is really great because it gives you the opportunity to go, you know what? I don't want to pay command tax. I'd rather pay 6/9 life for this effect. Let's do that instead. I think this card is still just generally slept on. I know it doesn't belong in every deck, but I think the power in certain groups, especially when your opponents know that you're the one to be taken out, this is pretty good. And I think it's worth testing. And that's it for this deck. I honestly really love it. I thought I knew exactly what it was going in, and I was so happy to find out that I was right. I love these kind of clone decks. I love these kind of blink decks. And Umbris has a very, very high ceiling. But without the right tools, without the right deck building construction or the right power level, it can be a rather clunky card. That being said, I think a lot of the blink strategy in blue-black is already strong enough that you can just kind of lean on it a bit more. Like, we're not even playing, for example, Null Drifter, which easily fits in this kind of deck, which then can be flickered to become I believe it's like a 7/7 Eldrazi with Annihilator 1, while on that first cast drawing you 2 cards. Very, very good card. Lots of options. Blink is just a very good strategy. So having this backdrop of having Umbris as this kind of alternative win condition, I think maybe the way I would do it. I still want to keep a lot of the mill. Altar of Dimension, notably, is very, very good in this deck, but having a deck that otherwise isn't that committed to to milling your opponents with Umbris as, you know what? That's the way I would build this. Okay. I'm thinking about this. I also, for a while, had Satoru here. I don't know if I still would, but it's worth considering in Blink decks. But I'm going to give this some thought. I think this would be... Remember earlier I said that high mana commanders are often used as backup plans or what we would say catch-up engines? Perhaps there's a way to have this as a blue-black flicker deck with Umbris being the catch-up clone mechanic. Still, I leave this up to you. I think this deck is really, really cool. I think the Nazgul could fit in if that's something you wanted to do. But as it is, I think it's a really cool idea. I hope this video was helpful to you. Thank you so much for setting the deck, Royal Beast. Always happy to see these decks. And good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.